Hi, welcome to Texas History. This is the third session of the seventh topic of the semester titled Modernity and Progress of Rise to Texas from 1876 to 1920. Now, this is session three, and before we initiate our discussion on the arrival of different industries in the state of Texas, I just want to recapture what we covered in session two so I can emphasize some points and also clarify others. Okay, so what we covered so far in session two is the actual modernization of Texas, the transformations that took place during this time, first and foremost with the development of a modern transportation system. I discussed this, the development of the railroad. I discussed quite, thoroughly how this process unfolded. And again, there were different railroad companies that were in charge of this development, like the Southern Pacific Company. I discussed that was building a line across Texas and all the way to the Pacific Ocean along the border with Mexico. And there's also, again, a number of different companies that were chartered by the state of Texas as well, about 40 different companies that were chartered to build railroads across the state of Texas in different, of course, in different regions and different locations. And they were really just connecting, communities together. They were connecting farms, cattle ranches, and so on, cities, and the like, again. They were provided, of course, great incentives like tax exemptions, for example, and land grants. I discussed that quite thoroughly. Now, I also discussed another great transformation that took place in the state of Texas with the transformation of agriculture. Agriculture, which was largely, really, an activity carried out by small families just growing their own food. This is called subsistence farming. This kind of subsistence farming is going to gradually change and become more commercialized. As there's going to be a great demand for food products in the United States as a result of the Industrial Revolution, in the United States, again, creating large industrial cities populated by millions of people, there was a great demand for grain and vegetables and other food products in the United States. And of course, this great demand pushed a lot of farmers and merchants and investors in the state of Texas to create a revolution in agriculture. Okay? They are now transforming agriculture into a business, into an enterprise, and they're moving into mass production. We see the rise of commercial farms. I talked about that. So there is now a gradual transition towards this more modern, more technological form of farming in the state of Texas. People are now trying to grow surplus grain for the market. Okay, there's a railroad already available for you to actually ship out your product, of course. So now that people have access to the railroad, now they want to participate in the national economy, ship out their product to other areas in the United States, not only to be consumed here locally in the state of Texas, but again, your product is going to leave the state in many cases and be consumed elsewhere around the United States. There's now transportation, of course. So again, in this transformation, what actually happened is that there was, of course, a push to reform the countryside, to reform agriculture itself. There's a new generation of politicians I discussed, the New South reformers, who were advising people of how to make this transition possible. I discussed that in great detail. Like diversification, for example, the need to actually include different crops in your fields, not rely on a single crop. I talked about that. There's also the technique of crop rotation, rotating, in different sectors, different plots in your own property. In a period of 5 or 7 years, you kind of rotate from one area to another in order to avoid depleting the soil from minerals and exhausting the land, for example. I also discussed that. And of course, the use of scientific methods and scientific farming, scientific knowledge as well, to be updated with the latest developments in agriculture was necessary. The latest fertilizers and pesticides and techniques, machinery, for example, tractors, irrigation systems, and the like. In other words, you have to really move in modern science and modern technology into your farm in the process of production in order to become more efficient and more effective. In other words, okay, so there's this great push. Now, another thing I want to emphasize and clarify again is this push towards a cotton-based economy in the state of Texas. I mentioned that cotton will become one of the most important crops in the state of Texas, and it did, by the way. This is something, again, that was nothing new about it. Cotton had been an important crop, even going back to the pre-war years, before the Civil War, that is to say. Cotton had been, of course, central to the Texas economy, but it's now becoming more central still to the Texas economy. And there's going to be a proliferation of cotton farms around the state of Texas. There are agricultural companies growing on a massive scale cotton, but also, again, there's going to be a lot of farmers that are going to be growing cotton for the market because it was quite profitable. Now, I mentioned that in this proliferation of cotton farms, there were, of course, farmers who did not have any land and had to rent lands in many cases in order to actually grow cotton and make some money. Okay, this is called tenancy. Again, so I'm kind of stressing and clarifying what those terms are. Tenancy, again, is when a landless farmer is really, just renting land from another farmer. Paying rents on a monthly basis, monies and so on, just to stay on the land to grow cotton and make some money. This didn't mean that they were actually getting rich, but they were just getting by, if you will. It was just enough for them to get by. Now, the sharecropping, this is something I want to clarify a little bit more. This system of sharecropping is very similar to tenancy, okay? Is really when a landless farmer, what I explained in session 2, is actually making deals with agricultural companies to grow cotton on their companies, and they're going to get paid with a share of the crop. That's one form of sharecropping. Again, you go to an agricultural company, you grow cotton for the company, and you're getting paid with cotton. Cotton was used as cash, in other words, but there was another type of sharecropping also that existed in the state of Texas, and that is when a landless farmer was renting lands from another farmer or a landlord to grow cotton, but instead of paying monies for rent, he had to share a certain portion of the harvest to the landlord. The landlord, in other words, was charging not necessarily money, but the landlord was charging a certain percentage of the yield. In other words, the farmer will have to pay cotton. So cotton was actually used as cash, in the system of sharecropping, either to pay rent to a landlord or to get paid in many cases when you were working for an agricultural company. So again, it became cash in a certain sense. So I just wanted to clarify that. Now let's move then to our discussion on the arrival of industries in the state of Texas. This is extremely important because this is, again, giving birth to an industrial revolution in the state of Texas. This is the very first industrial revolution for the state of Texas. Industrial capitalism, this economic system that I explained at the end of session 2, is becoming very well established now in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century in Texas. This idea of industries as the main form of enterprise, that is now providing jobs for people. And this is the how people are going to make money in the state of Texas. How people are going to make money? Well, if you have the capital, you can actually create a factory or an industry. And if you don't have the capital to create an industry, you can just work there for a wage. Again, so more and more, the way to make money is through what is called industrial capitalism. Open up a factory, an industry, and make money, or work for those companies again and earn wages. This is called wage labor. So more and more, the peoples of Texas are going to be earning their living through wages, through the payment of wages. Okay, so let's go over some of the most important industries or factories that arrived to the state of Texas in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Number one is the lumber industry. Again, the lumber industry is flourishing in certain parts of Texas, particularly in the east and south regions of Texas, where there were pine forests, again, large forests of pine trees. Now, why a lumber industry is going to flourish during this time has to do with the growing demand for wood in the United States. Not only the demand in Texas, but this was a national demand. Again, I explained, for example, the building of the railroad. I gave an explanation in session 2 of the different rail lines, the Pacific railroads that were building the railroads across the West. So again, the railroads required, of course, a lot of wood for the construction of the railroads. So the railroad companies were one of the main buyers or consumers of wood in the United States. There's also, again, a housing market in the United States. A lot of construction work taking place. This is a time of great transformation for the United States as the United States is moving westward, as Americans are moving west, and they're settling a lot of areas of the West, for example, like the Great Plains region, or they're settling in the West Coast, or they're settling in Colorado, in the Southwest, and so on. In all of those regions, there was a great demand for wood to build houses, that is to say. So again, there's a lot of construction work. So this placed an enormous demand again on the lumber industries, something that Texas benefited from again because they had this natural resource again. Also again, wood was used to build freight platforms in the coastline for ports in Houston, for example, Galveston. Those were the platforms in which, again, the ships were arriving and cargoes and merchandise were loaded into those ships again. So there's a lot of those platforms being built. And this is another area where wood was needed as well. Okay, so once again, there are, of course, a wide variety of different needs for wood as well in the United States. This is not the only one, but because there is a railroad revolution taking place in the United States, because Americans are moving westward, and there's a lot of construction work, and for the need of course to build houses and the like, and there's of course the need to build the platforms and the ports and so on. This is going to place an enormous demand on the lumber industries in the United States, something again that, as I mentioned, Texas benefit from. All right, so just by 1890, the lumber industries alone had created about 7,000 jobs in the states, about 7,000 jobs. Those were actually jobs in which people were cutting trees and the like again. And again, it was a massive operation. This is not to ignore, of course, also the need to build ships, in the United States, shipbuilding as well, for ships, shipping, and the like, of course. So there's a wide variety, of course, of uses, but those were the main ones. Okay. The other industry that was kind of connected to the lumber industry was the lumber mills, okay, the sawmills in this case. Texas also gave birth to a number of different lumber mills or sawmills because there was the need, of course, to cut the trees into wood. different sizes of wood and the like, of course. And that's something that had to be done or processed again in those lumber mills. Again, so this is an industry that was semi-connected, if you will, to the lumber industries, the lumber mills. Also, in different cities of Texas, we're going to see those kinds of industries. Those were kind of smaller factories, if you will. Those are not really gigantic, industrial plants. Those were kind of medium-sized factories in which maybe 50, 80 individuals will be working there cutting wood and the like. Again, wood that will be packaged and it will be actually shipped out into different parts of the country for the railroad companies, again, that I mentioned, to the Western Territories, from the Western Territories, the Western states as well, for housing. The other industry that flourished in Texas was the salt industry as well, the salt industry. The salt industry was flourishing in the United States as a result primarily of the rise of the food industry, particularly the canned food industry in the United States. Okay, now there's a great demand, of course, for salt for domestic purposes. Again, the people use it as a condiment, to provide flavor to dishes and food and the like. Of course, this has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. Again, this is nothing new. But during this time, in the late 19th century, we're going to see the rise of the food industry, particularly the canned industry. Okay, food is being canned. Vegetables and other food products are being canned, put in cans, and salt was used as a preservative. This is how the food is preserved inside of the can, that is to say. Okay, so there was a growing demand for that because, again, we got a new product on the rise. There are cans, food cans, and the like, and of course, there's a need for salt. Now, of course, during this time in the state of Texas, people also use salt as a preservative as well, to conserve beef, for example, to cure hams. If you want to, for example, create beef jerky or ham, that will last for months and months at a time without actually, getting spoiled. Well, one way is to rub the beef or whatever meat that is with salt, and salt is going to actually cook to a certain degree the meat, and is going to preserve it as well. And of course, beef jerky was very, very popular in the 19th century, particularly the latter part of the 19th century. People who travel a lot, that went from place to place, in many cases without any food, carry with them beef jerky, and this is how they were getting by. Again, this is not really the ideal meal, but it does provide protein and energy to keep the body alive. Again, it's a very practical way to carry food without getting spoiled. Okay, so it was very popular, among the cowboys, for example, or just people that live on the countryside, didn't have any refrigerators during that time, and salt was really needed. This is how people preserved food before the age of chemicals, before the age of refrigerators. Again, so there's going to be an industry called the Grand Saline Plant, created in 1889 in the state of Texas, and this is going to be a flourishing industry in the state of Texas that will be exporting salt all over the country, by the way. All right, so another industry that emerged during this time were the foundries. Okay, those are actually metal shops, if you will, okay, or metal factories. Those are not necessarily steel plants. Again, we're not talking about gigantic industrial plant that is manufacturing steel. the way it's being done in the city of Pittsburgh, for example, or in Alabama. You got the large, again, steel plants there. Instead, this is like a medium-sized kind of factory that is going to be crafting a lot of iron tools, iron works, that is to say. This is the larger version of the shop of the blacksmith. You know, blacksmiths in the past were the ones that were actually crafting iron. You know, those were actually working with smelting iron ore, for example, and turning the iron ore into tools like wheels. They will, you know, craft things like horseshoes or blades, plows for agriculture, and the like, all the different, you know, instruments of work for agriculture, for cattle ranching, and the like. But this is the larger version of that. Again, this is a much larger shop. It's a metal shop that will be engaged now in the manufacturing of ironworks and plows in the state of Texas. Well, again, this is not really necessarily an industry that is mass producing. You know, they're not really, again, producing thousands and thousands, again, of iron works. But again, this is leading up to this point. Again, this is really building up, if you will, the industry that in the future will become a large industry. Again, those are actually iron tools that will transform the area of hardware, for example. You know, the hardware stores. During that time, most of the equipment, most of the instruments, the tools of hardware were actually be built by the foundries as well during this time. Okay, all right. Number 5, another industry emerging during this time were the cotton gins, or the cotton mills. Again, the different names, if you will. The cotton gin itself is a machine that was invented back in 1793 by Eli Whitney. Again, so this is, again, a machine that actually revolutionized industry in the late 1700s. It was invented by an American scientist, Eli Whitney, from Massachusetts, New England, that is to say. So the very first cotton mills were established in New England. So the way this machine works is that it cleans cotton. The cotton gin, what it does is that actually it cleans the cotton fiber, because when cotton is picked from the fields, it's very dirty. You know, cotton is not really clean. It has a lot of seeds and stems, and it has dirt and the like. It's very mushy as well. So all of this cotton fiber has to be cleansed and separated, if you will, before people start weaving it. You know, that's essential. And what Eli Whitney did is that he invented a device that accelerated the pace of cleaning up the cotton, the cotton balls, if you will. There's just, again, a lot of cotton that were harvested at the end of the year, and that needed to be cleansed before being processed for the manufacturing of clothing, of course. And that really stopped or delayed a lot of the production in industry, if you will, that people had to do that by hand before the cotton gin. So with the cotton gin, you're going to save a lot of money and a lot of labor, and you know, a lot of time as well, because you're just going to, you know, accelerate the cleaning process, and now you can actually sell the clean cotton to the industries, of course. And so the North actually was the hub of the Industrial Revolution. They had the cotton mills cleaning the cotton, and they had the factories as well, the textile factories. But now, the textile industry is moving down into the South, and a lot of states in the South, like Texas, were adopting the techniques, the machinery, the technologies of the North. Again, this is a great example of that now in the state of Texas, we're going to see this technology coming in, into the state, and people, investors, are going to be creating factories, if you will, or shops, warehouses, or mills, if you will, in which they're going to actually set up a lot of those cotton gins, bring people in, pay them a wage in order to just do that, just clean cotton. Cotton is grown in Texas anyways, so instead of just shipping the cotton out into other states for other states to clean it, this is something, again, that will be done here in Texas. Okay. Number 6, another industry that emerged during this time were the grain mills. Okay. There was, of course, a demand for food products in the state of Texas. We're going to be talking about the growth of the cities in Texas. Again, there's more and more people to feed. So there was a need to create flour, for example, and oil. There was a great demand for flour and oil in Texas and all over the country, by the way. Again, this is not just Texas, it's all over the United States. So there is going to be, of course, grain mills, those industries that will be grinding, if you will, grains, different kinds of grains, like wheat, for example, to make flour. This is how people, make bread, for example. One of the uses, again, of flour is to make bread. It's not the only use, by the way. They're also going to be grinding, of course, corn, for cornmeal, if you will, for different kinds of food products as well, than foodstuffs. So again, this is going to be packaged and sold in grocery stores and so on around Texas, and it will be very convenient, a very convenient way to actually have a processed food, which you can actually, in your own home, turn into different kinds of foods. That is to say. So again, this is the beginning time of the beginning stages of that. As I explained, in session 1 and in session 2, prior to this time, people were just growing their own food and consuming the food, as the food was collected from the ground. There was not a lot of industrial processing to speak of in the past. Again, so if farmers were growing things like corn or wheat, they will actually grind, the wheat themselves and create their own bread. They didn't buy the flour, Everything was done at home. Everything. This is something that I explained, earlier, of course. So I want you to see again that there's a change. Now people are going to the store and getting that now finished product. Instead of doing it at home yourself, you just buy the flour, in other words, okay? There's going to be an industry that is going to be doing just that for you. That is to say, and also oil. For cooking, for example, you need oils and so on. And cottonseed and other kinds of oils were also produced by the grain mills, mills as well. Okay, so this is something that you also buy in the store. Whereas in the past, when people needed to cook, they used things like lard. Okay, and lard comes from from the pigs, for example, and people use the lard in order to cook. But now they're going to be using different kinds of vegetable oils because now, of course, there are industries that are doing that. Okay, and people are buying it now in the store. Okay, so things are changing. Okay, the times are changing. The way people do stuff, the way people produce food is also changing as well. Okay, now I want to talk about another very important industry that is going to become extremely important for the Texas economy, and that is cattle ranching. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, cattle ranching, is that really an industry? This is, again, sort of like an agricultural type of, activity. This is like something that really existed in Texas ever since the late 1600s. We talked about that, when the Spaniards moved cattle in Texas, and, it proliferated in Texas to the point that when Spanish colonists began to arrive to Texas in the 1700s, there was the creation of hundreds and hundreds of cattle ranches in Texas, and a lot of families just rounded up this wild cattle, put it inside of fences, and they just had like a mini ranch, to start with. This is how cattle ranching actually began. It was just wild cattle. There were thousands and thousands of cattle just roaming freely in the ranges of Texas, and people just arrived, the colonists, and pretty much rounded it up. So this is something that had existed in the state of Texas. There were very wealthy ranches with the largest territories and so on, with hundreds and hundreds of cattle, and there were more smaller type of ranches in which a small family pretty much managed and owned a small plot of land and move cattle. Of course, we talked about that in the past. However, after the Civil War, particularly during this time, as we approach the 1870s and beyond, cattle ranching will become an industry in Texas. Okay, it will take industrial proportions, that is to say. So this is extremely important, that we're not talking about the traditional cattle ranch anymore, the way it existed in the past. Cattle ranching will take now the size, if you will, of industry. The operations, the scope, the management, and even the finance behind it will be totally industrial. Again, that is to say that cattle ranchers in Texas are going to be mass producing cattle by the thousands. Again, we're moving into the era of mass production. Remember, this is what really industry is all about. Again, is mass production. So when we talk about industrial cattle ranching, we're really talking about mass production, the use of capital, the use of technology, the use of science in order to maximize the production of a certain product, in this case, cattle. So the reason why we're going to see the rise of industrial cattle ranching in the United States had to do primarily with a boom, a cattle ranching boom in the United States. Okay, why there was a boom? Why, in other words, what were the reasons why we're going to see a boom in cattle ranching? Well, this boom had to do with certain demands. Once again, the demand of a product is directly involved in creating an economic boom in the supply, that is to say. So cattle ranchers were the suppliers of cattle, and they faced a real demand, an increasing demand for cattle in the United States that they just accommodated to. Okay, so what were those demands? Okay, so number one, northern farmers and northern cattle ranchers demanded cattle because during the Civil War, cattle was totally depleted in the North. The reasons for that had to do with the Civil War itself. Okay, so during the Civil War, the North, or the Union, the northern states, were pretty much very well organized, in other words, to pretty much manage the war and feed the troops and the like. So in order to feed the troops, the Union Army, the producers in the North, whether they were farmers or cattle ranchers, had to pretty much divert all of their resources to the troops, that is to say. So thousands and thousands of cattle were slaughtered during the Civil War in order to feed the troops, in order to sustain the war effort, that is to say. Okay? So after the end of the Civil War, the population of cattle in the North was significantly reduced. That in order for cattle ranchers and farmers to really go back to normal, they needed really an astronomical number of cattle to be shipped from the southern states, where there was a lot of cattle, into the northern states. In other words, just to get started. In other words, they said, well, we really don't have any cattle anymore. So if we want to continue with our operations here in the north, well, we need a lot of cattle. So we were willing to buy it from the southern cattle ranchers, particularly in Kansas and in Texas. Those were the important centers for cattle ranching during this time. So again, there was number one, a growing demand by northern cattle ranchers and farmers for cattle. Again, that's reason number one. But most importantly is that the second demand for cattle had to do with the invention of the refrigerator rail car. That is to say that after the end of the Civil War, there was a new technology now being made available in the United States, and that was the refrigerator itself. But again, this refrigerator was placed in a rail car, which enabled, in this case, cattle ranchers or the meat industry. There's going to be now a growing meat industry to transport meat and beef across state lines, which was really impossible in the past. If you had a cattle ranch, prior to this time, you couldn't really ship out once the animal is slaughtered. You could not really ship out the meat, very far away. The meat had to be consumed by the local population. Once the animal is slaughtered, you have a very limited amount of time in order to consume that product, because otherwise it will just go bad, of course. Okay, so now with the refrigerator rail car, you can actually freeze the meat and transport it anywhere around the country. And now supermarkets all over the United States are going to be now offering all kinds of meat products, whether it's pork or beef, chicken, and the like. Because you can freeze it. In other words, you can preserve it, you can freeze it. So Americans began to now consume more and more beef. It was a rare, really, food item for many people. Most people consume pork up to this time. Pork was the national meat prior to this time. Again, what most Americans ate was actually pork. But now, as people are now finding more and more beef in their local supermarkets because of the refrigerator rail car, now they're going to be shifting to beef. They're going to be demanding more and more of this food product, moving away a little bit, from the traditional pork, and now moving towards beef. So beef will become, after this time, now the national meat, if you will. Okay, so those two factors, the northern demand for cattle and the invention of the refrigerator rail car, really were the forces that transformed cattle ranching in the United States and transformed cattle ranching, of course, in the state of Texas. Cattle ranchers in the state of Texas now have a national demand for cattle. Okay, no longer local, no longer regional, but is national. Okay, all over the country. Okay, and because the demand is growing exponentially, they understood that they needed to transform their ranches into industrial ranches. In other words, look, we can no longer, continue with the same practices, the same techniques, of the past, because in the past we were not concerned with mass production. Now we need to learn something new. How can we generate thousands and thousands of cattle very quickly? What kind of knowledge, what kind of breed do we need to get a hold of that will enable us to produce more and more cattle, every year? What kind of breed will give more meat per pound? In other words, okay. So all of that, all of those issues, all of those questions were studied by cattle ranchers in Texas and elsewhere. And cattle ranchers arrived to the conclusion that if they were going to actually adopt one of the most successful and efficient forms of cattle ranching, and they pretty much studied ranching models from around the world. I mean, there were, ranching models from Africa, in Europe, for example, in South America, Mexico, and the like. Of all of those ranching models, they determined that the most productive was the Mexican ranch model. In other words, that this model was the most efficient, the most effective, the most productive for the mass production of cattle. Okay, of course, Mexico has been grazing cattle for centuries, ever since the 1500s, when the Spaniards introduced cattle in Mexico. Cattle ranching was the central enterprise one of the most important enterprises again in Mexico up to this point. A lot of people in Mexico were very skilled, very knowledgeable about managing cattle because this has been pretty much the, the main form of subsistence for the Mexican people. This model was now imported and adopted into Texas. Okay, the different methods, for example, of management, like branding cattle, it was very important. You need to brand cattle because that's the only way you can identify, which cattle belongs to you. If cattle runs away, which it often did, by the way, cattle can actually escape. They destroy the fences. In order to identify your cattle, well, you have to brand it. The rounding up the cattle as well, all those techniques, with roping and the like, that was used in Mexico. All of that was now imported into Texas, and we're going to see the rise of the Texas cowboy. And the Texas cowboy was really just following the methods of the Mexican cowboy. Okay, this is again something that occurred during this time. There was really the incorporation of techniques coming from Mexico about how to manage and handle cattle. And even the breed itself, the cattle breed, was also imported from Mexico. It was determined one of the most productive breeds of cattle was the Mexican Longhorn. Okay, the Mexican Longhorn is an animal that gives you more meat per pound. In other words, okay. So this is a breed that was also imported from Mexico and became really the preferred breed in the Texas cattle ranches as well. We kind of associate the Longhorn with Texas now, thinking that that this breed is native or somewhat indigenous to Texas, but rather this is from Mexico. Okay. Now, because we're now looking at a new kind of cattle ranch, those are more industrial, those are larger, again, estates, those are really large ranches that are going to be perhaps the largest ranches in the world. As a matter of fact, Texas will become known as to have the largest cattle ranches, not only in the United States or even the continent of America, but the largest cattle ranches in the world as a whole, with millions and millions of acres, each one of them. Those were very wealthy merchants and investors that were moving into Texas because there's a growing demand for cattle in the United States. Well, Texas attracted, of course, people from different parts of the country that were bringing in capital and then establishing large industrial cattle ranches, and they're going to become like little cattle kingdoms in their own right. Okay, they were known as to be cattle kingdoms. For example, the King Ranch in the Rio Grande Valley, we're talking about the southeastern portion of Texas, was really considered the largest ranch in the world. The ranch itself was bigger than the country of Portugal in Europe. Again, you can only imagine, how can a cattle ranch be bigger than a European country in this case? And Portugal used to be, of course, one of the richest empires, of course, in the past. So this is comparable. Again, that we're really looking at great fortunes, great wealth being created in Texas through this kind of industry. They call the cattle ranch. Of course, now in other areas of Texas, we're going to see the rise of another cattle kingdom. This is in the Panhandle area in the northwestern section of Texas. It's called the Panhandle. This is an area in which a group of merchants and investors, very wealthy, arrived to the region, and well, during this time, they have been yet lands that were considered open ranges, not necessarily lands that were already occupied or developed by settlers or anybody. In other words, there were no people there. Those were just considered open ranges, in other words. So what those merchants and investors did, they moved cattle into those open ranges in order for the cattle to graze there, eat the vegetation and the like, in other words. And over time, as the cattle multiply in those open ranges, they began to fence it. And in reality, they started claiming the land for themselves as private property. They seize large portions of territories, in other words, in the Panhandle region, and creating another cattle kingdom. In other words, so again, this is a little bit different. And just again, a lot of very wealthy investors moving cattle to those open ranges, and over time they just fence the land and seize the lands, if you will, and created a ranch there. It was gigantic. This was considered a kingdom as well. The Panhandle cattle kingdom owned by tycoons. It was actually dubbed that way. The Panhandle cattle tycoons. The tycoons are extremely wealthy individuals that are creating a cattle empire, if you will, a cattle kingdom in the North Texas. Now, of course, there was a need for labor in those industrial ranches, and in particular, not just any labor. The owners of those industries understood that they require skilled labor, people with skills, how to handle, how to manage, the cattle. So what they did was to hire people coming in from Mexico. As a matter of fact, there's going to be an influx of Mexican immigration. Starting around 1870, there was a large influx of people coming in from Mexico during this time. There will be about 3 million Mexican immigrants coming into the United States, by the way, and a great many of them are coming into Texas, and a great many of them end up working in those ranches. And they were hired particularly because they were very skilled at handling cattle. Those were the Mexican cowboys. In Spanish, they're called vaqueros. The Mexican vaquero is really the Mexican cowboy, if you will. Okay, they were the assistants to the supervisors and the owners of those ranches. So the supervisor might be the typical Texas cowboy, who is like the second-hand supervisor manager of the actual owner, but beneath that Texas cowboy, there was a host of other cowboys. Many of them were called vaqueros, Mexican vaqueros, or Mexican cowboys, of course. And together, they were managing those cattle empires, driving cattle in many cases up north. They will have to be driving cattle up north because ultimately all the cattle was shipped into the United States. Again, it was being driven in great numbers by those Texas and Mexican cowboys up north to places like Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado, again, where the train stations were located before the railroad, of course, arrived to the state of Texas, before 1880, of course. Still, there were just massive cattle trails in which people were going, again, moving cattle from Southeast Texas, from the King Ranch up north, or from the Panhandle region, moving the cattle up north to Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado, where the cattle is being, again, taken to places like Chicago. Chicago was the hub of the meat packing industries. The slaughter industries and the meat packing plants were located in Chicago, where the cattle is going to be slaughtered, and it will be, of course, the meat will be packaged and distributed around the country, of course. By 1880, about 6 million cattle was being driven to the north through those cattle trails. Again, this is before the railroad actually arrived to Texas. So we're talking about, again, still 1880, the railroad is very being developed in Texas, as we mentioned in session 2. Okay, so before this time, we see those famous legendary trails again of cowboys driving cattle up north and the great demand. So again, so those are considered, once again, industries. The cattle ranches, again, of Texas are now considered industries in their own right. Now, one of the last industries I want to talk about are the energy industries. Energy is also going to become central to the Texas economy. Part of this industrial revolution that is taking place in the state of Texas. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, this industrial revolution is taking more and more areas of energy production. In other words, one of the primary industrial centers of Texas, that will be really important in terms of job creation, capital and technology, if you will, generating monumental, astronomical revenues for those companies and for the state of Texas will be the energy industries, energy companies. So we start with the coal industry. Okay, the coal industry was one of the first energy industries that flourished in the state of Texas. Coal is, even today, considered an energy resource, of course. It's a fossil fuel in this case. Okay. During this time, coal was still largely used in the railroad industry. This is the fuel of the railroads, the steam engines that I mentioned in the past, of course, that propel the engines of the railroads, function with coal. Up to this time, still that's the norm, but also for the steam engines in ships. The ships that are now functioning in the United States also have steam engines as well. Okay, the ships. So there's, of course, a great demand for coal. This resource had been really the engine, the fuel of the Industrial Revolution up to this time. So coal was discovered in Stephen County in 1879 in Texas. Of course, there is a great demand by the railroad industry that is moving across the West. They place an enormous demand on coal, and this was beneficial for the state because now there's yet another resource that Texas has, a natural resource that can be commercialized, exploited for this purpose. Just like the pine trees I mentioned. Remember, there was a great demand for wood. Okay, there's forests, there's pine forests in Texas. Well, those natural resources were being commercialized. With the growing of the lumber industry. The same with coal in this case. So we see the establishment of coal mining in the state of Texas that are going to generate, of course, a lot of revenues for the state. In 1870, there was only $1 million generated from coal in the state of Texas, but after the discovery of coal in Stephen County, of course, this is going to move up to $5 million per year by 1900. Again, so this is an emergent, growing industry, the coal industry. Now, there will be yet another energy industry that, as we'll see, is going to really eclipse and overshadow completely the coal industry to a very large extent, and that is the oil industry. Oil will be discovered in Texas, and this is going to be yet another natural resource found in the state that is going to transform the economy of Texas. And it's an energy resource. The first oil well was discovered in Corsicana in 1894. This was considered not necessarily a major discovery. Not yet. Again, this is not something that, wow, this is going to really revolutionize the Texas economy and industry. Well, not yet. But this is really the stepping stone, if you will, because this attracted a lot of investors from Pennsylvania who were involved in the oil industry in the Northeast, by the way. Okay? So there's a lot of investors coming from without, out of state, to develop the very first oil platforms. In Texas, they're bringing not only capital, they bring the know-how, the science, the technology. In other words, they're the ones that are going to be starting to really give shape and form to an oil industry in the state of Texas. Now, of course, oil up to this time was not necessarily an energy resource that would found a lot of uses in the United States. It found some uses. For example, oil was used to create certain derivatives like oil, for example, for oil lamps. Areas that did not have any electricity were still using oil lamps during this time. They use oil for lubricants. In the railroads, for example, lubricants were actually used to lubricate the different mechanical parts, or lubricants for industries, in which, again, in certain processes, lubricants were needed to oil the machines and the like. There were some uses. Again, this is not to really discard that oil was not important. It was. But as we'll see, in just a few years, oil is going to become even more central for the energy industry in the United States because of the different uses, again, that people found from it. So the Pennsylvania investors began to transform now the energy industry of Texas by giving birth again to an industry that is now generating significant revenues. About 866,000 barrels per oil were extracted a year from this operation. Because it was a significant amount of oil extracted each year, just in Texas alone, we're going to see the development of oil refineries. What the Pennsylvania investors determined it was that it was necessary to refine the oil in Texas itself, as opposed to be shipping the oil out of state so it could be refined in other areas of the United States, in other states, that is to say, the way it was done. So I said, well, instead of actually paying for transportation costs and shipping the crude oil elsewhere, why don't we just invest in oil refineries? Those are actually industries that take the crude oil and actually refine it and transform it into derivatives, the ones I explained, like oils and lubricants and the like, to be done here in the state. So they formed the very first refinery. They call it the Magnolia Petroleum Company. This is, again, a company that is going to become known as Mobil. Okay, Mobil Company, if you will. This is a time that oil is becoming more and more important in energy resources. For example, in the railroad industry, railroads determined that it was easier to shift from coal to oil because it was more plentiful. In other words, look, there's more oil than coal. It is easier to extract it than coal, so it's more it's less expensive. In other words, more cost effective. So railroads began to actually transform their machinery, their steam engines again, which used coal in the past to propel the railroads. They're going to be now working to create new engines that will be functioning with oil. So they're now transitioning the railroad industry at the end of the 19th century to oil, switching from coal to oil. Again, so oil is going to find, a great demand in this railroad industry. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why oil is becoming more and more central, because people are finding more and more uses for it, like the railroads, for example. Okay, now the real turning point in the state of Texas when it comes to the oil industry came in 1901. Oil was discovered in Spindletop, Texas in 1901. And again, this was a massive discovery that dwarfed the discovery of Corsicana. There was no comparison. Just, the Pennsylvania investors, of course, when they came, realized that, well, if there was oil found in Texas, in Stephen County again, well, why not just bring a team of scientists in order to really explore more veins of oil elsewhere? Again, oil exists in Texas. It's just a matter of finding it in other places. So there's a lot of oil exploration taking place. Again, this discovery was not just made out of accident. So the Pennsylvania investors brought a scientific team that was successful in finding another vein of oil that really proved that Texas was sitting on a gigantic pool of oil. And this was in Spindletop. The spillage was so large that when they were able to control it, there were more than 500,000 barrels that were spilled in the area. From an ecological standpoint, I mean, you can say that it really kind of devastated, of course, the area ecologically. But if you just want to see it from an economics point of view, I mean, what this really proved is that, again, there was massive amounts of oil sitting underneath the state of Texas. So again, this is what actually the discovery in Spindletop actually proved. So again, this gave rise to something called black gold. The peoples of Texas now realized that they were rich. In other words, the state of Texas is actually rich. We have a lot of resources, but we just discovered that there's a lot of oil underneath us. In other words, waiting to be extracted, and of course, it was becoming so valuable around the world, oil itself, that it was becoming like gold. That's why it was dubbed black gold, a new energy resource. And this is going to be really the energy of the 20th century. This is how the economies of the world are going to function with oil, in the 20th century. Okay? And of course, there will be yet more oil exploration taking place in Texas. Well, if we found oil in Spindletop, well, there has to be a lot of oil everywhere. So again, there was a lot of exploration. Again, team of scientists that were sponsored, financed by oil companies to look for oil all over the state. And of course, the state of Texas chartered during this time 491 oil companies as a result of more and more discoveries. What this actually led up to again was the discovery that Texas as a whole, not just the East Coast of the Gulf Coast, but the entire state was actually sitting on oil. That is to say, the Panhandle, the western part of Texas was also again covered with oil. That is to say, so we're going to see the proliferation of a great number of oil companies propping up pretty much everywhere. About 491, again, companies were chartered by the state to extract oil for the state of Texas. Okay, by 1902, Texas alone was producing 21 million barrels per year. By 1929, it was producing 293 million barrels per year. And it had already generated about 13,000 jobs. So the oil industry was really becoming central to the Texas economy. It was becoming really the dominant industry in Texas. We just spoke about a number of industries in the past, from the lumber industry, the sawmills and the grain mills and the foundries and the like, but nothing compared really to the oil industries of Texas. Again, in terms of revenues, for example, job creation, again, is massive. So we're going to see the rise of petroleum-based industries in Texas. For example, we're going to see the rise of oil corporations. Again, the corporation was really the largest type of enterprise, that will flourish during this age. By the way, I mean, when we talk about the late 19th century, the 20th century, it is really the corporation, the largest enterprise. It's just a conglomeration of different industries This is again a very large company that is going to be perhaps headquartered in one city, in one state of the country, but will have outlets and will have, of course, extensions all over the country, of course, owned by investors and stockholders and the like, and the value of the shares fluctuate. You can actually trade the stock and the like. Again, this is a really different kind of economic entity. It's very large, by the way. We're going to see the rise of oil corporations in Texas, like the Houston Oil Company. There will be four oil corporations arising in the state of Texas, mostly based in Houston, Texas, where there were oil fields, of course, in the Gulf Coast. Again, and that's why one of the reasons why we're going to see them in Houston is because, again, most of the oil was located around that area. The Houston Oil Company, the J.M. Guffey Petroleum Company, the Gulf Oil, J.S. Cullinan Company, and the Sun Oil Company. Again, about four major oil corporations are arising. Now, besides those corporations, we're going to see, of course, refineries. More and more refineries being built in the state of Texas. There's now new knowledge to actually transform the crude oil into different derivatives, like, for example, oils, gasoline. Gasoline will be another derivative from oil. And this is going to be used for the automobile industry. We're going to be talking about that, of course, in a future topic, the automobile industry. Diesel for tractors, in agriculture or large trucks and so on. Petroleum, gas, and asphalt. Asphalt, of course, is used to build the paved roads, the highways, and the like. All of that, again, is instrumental for the building of the highway systems and roads in the United States. So there's a great demand, again, for oil derivatives in the United States, something that the refineries are actually making. And there's a couple of refineries that are going to arise during this time. The Humble Oil and Refining Company and the Texas Company Refinery. Again, those are actually companies that are making the oils, the gasoline, the diesel, the asphalt, and the like. Now, the Texas Company Refinery is going to be actually engaged also in building pipelines from Port Arthur in the Gulf Coast all the way to Oklahoma, because there's also, again, oil production in Oklahoma. So instead of the state of Oklahoma refining the oil themselves, they're going to be actually transporting the oil through those pipelines all the way to Port Arthur, where the oil is being refined into those finished products I mentioned. There's also going to be the petrochemical industry in 1923. This is an industry that also processes the crude oil, but through chemical processes, they're going to create other kinds of products out of oil, like lubricants, plastic. Again, plastic is made from oil. Rubber, for the manufacturing of the tires for the automobiles, for example. It's also made from oil. Fiber, raw materials, and the like. Again, so there's a proliferation of oil-based companies, industries, corporations taking place as a result of those discoveries I just mentioned in the state of Texas. Again, this is extremely important for understanding the very first industrial revolution in Texas, how industry is becoming more and more one of the central pillars of the Texas economy. One of the pillars is agriculture, largely based on cotton production, but at the same time, we see, of course, industries. One of the most important industries will be the oil industry. That is also going to be sustaining the Texas economy as well. Now, the last part I want to talk about, again, is the rise of modern urban centers. Texas society is going to modernize because we're going to see the rise, the development of modern metropolitan cities. People are going to be moving to the cities, in other words, from the countryside. They're going to be flocking by the tens of thousands to the industrial centers where the industries were located, all of the industries I mentioned. They were offering jobs. Well, what this led to was that there was going to be a reconcentration of people. People that used to live in the countryside will be moving in great numbers now to those industrial centers, giving rise to something called the metropolitan city. There's going to be demographic growth, in other words, population growth, in Texas as a result of people migrating into the urban centers, not necessarily from the countryside in Texas, but also from out of state. There's a lot of people coming into Texas as a result, for example, of this oil boom I just talked about. You know, when oil was discovered in Texas, that attracted a lot of people to come into Texas. A lot of people are coming with skills, with education. These are professionals, again, that have university degrees, and they're going to be taking on jobs in those industries in terms of, like engineers and chemists, for example, mathematicians, accountants, and so on. But there's also a lot of people coming into Texas from outer state with no skills. They're just here to engage in mining, work, in metal work, or in the oil fields and the like. There's a lot of, again, jobs available in Texas during this time. Another really important development during this time is that women also flocked to the cities in great numbers. One of the reasons why the cities were growing was also because women were moving there and they entered the workforce, particularly during World War One, after 1914, because when World War One occurred and the United States came into the war in 1917, a lot of men in the United States, again, left their farms and left their cities and their jobs to sign up for the armed forces to fight in Europe. So there were really millions of jobs across the country, again, that were vacant, that somebody needed to actually do. And women came in order to really do jobs that were previously done by men inside of industries. The same is true for Texas. So Texas also, again, had a shortage of labor because of World War One, and women came in, they moved into the cities, and they started taking on industrial jobs, but also taking on other jobs in like telephone operators, clerical workers, teachers, nurses, and librarians. So there's really a great transformation, again, in the world of women as well. So this is one of the reasons why cities were also growing exponentially. And just to give you a snapshot here very quickly, the city of Houston grew to almost integrate 292,000 plus people. Again, this is becoming one of the largest cities, again, in Texas. Because of the oil industries and the international port. In other words, the oil industries were flourishing in Texas as when the oil corporations were headquartered, and it's also because it was an international port. This is where shipping was taking place in and out of Texas again. They have the Houston Ship Channel again, in which again people were coming in with merchandise from different parts of Texas and shipping out their products overseas. So again, it's a major center for international commerce. Fort Worth was already reaching 163,000 plus as well, as a result of being a hub for shipping out cattle. And as was known, Fort Worth as a cow town, had a rail station and stockyards in which cattle ranchers, particularly from the Panhandle area, were now moving in their cattle and pretty much leaving their cattle there in those stockyards until the train will come in and ship out, of course, their cattle to the north of the United States, particularly to Chicago. So this again is going to grow significantly. Dallas will be another very great metropolitan city with more than 260,000 people. This is again the hub of the financial and business center for the state of Texas. Banking, that is to say. Again, this is where if you wanted to get a loan in order to start a business, to buy machinery, new technology, to invest it in land, you will go to a banker in Dallas. Again, this is where the major banking centers, the financial centers, were located as well. Okay, San Antonio was reaching 231,000 plus people. This was the base of manufacturing for Texas. manufacturing base, foundries and mills and the like. It also had a military base. A military base had been established there that also attracted, of course, commerce in order to supply the base with all of the products that they required, of course. And also a center for tourism, a tourist industry. It was attracting tourists from all over the country to visit San Antonio as a town of Spanish heritage, like the missions and the like. It was becoming a very beautiful town that was visited by thousands of people every year because of its Spanish heritage as well. El Paso, again, another city that was also growing exponentially, 102,000 plus people. This was a center for smelting and mining as well. Okay, now inside of the cities, what we see is that there's going to be a lot of development taking place of city services like utilities, for example. There are going to be electrical companies, for example, offering electricity to the people living there. There will be the rise of new electrical companies like the Texas Power and Light Company, for example. Again, so there's electricity coming into Texas, there's electrical companies, they hire more people, there's more jobs, of course. This is something that is a feature of modern cities. So again, the times are changing in Texas. People are no longer living in the countryside and using oil lamps. They're living in cities and they have electricity, of course. Natural gas companies as well. People are now using stoves, in which they use gas in order to cook their meals, as opposed to using firewood. In the past, prior to this time, back in the countryside, people used firewood in order to cook. That era is coming to an end gradually. We see the system of roads and highways being developed as a result of the automobile in the 1910s and 20s in Texas. So those cities are going to become, very well developed because there's going to be paved roads and there's going to be interstate highways connecting the cities, for example, Fort Worth and Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Galveston. They're all going to be connected through a system of roads and highways. So this is another feature, of modern societies in Texas. And likewise, there's also going to be, of course, leisure and entertainment facilities, public parks, zoos, swimming pools, ballparks, and the like. This will become another feature of the modern industrial city. Okay, so people in Texas, again, are totally finding a whole new reality that was radically different from the traditional setting of the past. In the cities, there's plenty of things to do. You can go to the park, the zoo, and there's swimming pools, and so on. So leisure activities, entertainment, and the like, of course. Also, in the cities, as I mentioned in session one of the reasons why people move to the cities is because they find the centers of education there, the learning centers, and these education systems. Remember, cities, this is the place where people find the arts, the sciences, they find the universities. This is where people get educated, in other words, So this is exactly what's happening in Texas. There's going to be a great push to foster, the development of a high-tech society. There's the need to educate the future generations with the new tools, with the new science to function in this new economy. It's called the industrial economy. We need engineers. We need scientists, chemists, physicists, mathematicians, to work in the oil companies or in the agricultural sector, transforming it and the like. So during this time in the Texas cities that I mentioned, there's going to be the creation of a public education system, again, to really, prepare the future generations for a high-tech world. This got started in 1884 when the law of 1884 in Texas created the school districts, dividing, of course, different areas within the city into districts, each governed by a superintendent. The districts that created different schools from elementary, high school, and middle school are going to be sustained through taxes. It's called district taxes, and we're going to require teachers to get certification. In other words, not anybody can just become a teacher. You have to have a degree and you have to be certified to teach, in other words. Okay, so there's going to be certain standards in order to actually, work inside of those school districts. There's also going to be a great push to create higher education in the state of Texas. That is to say, universities, technical schools and the like, to prepare people for the future, offering degrees in science, technology, law, and liberal arts, in which, again, one of the major areas of study and specialization will be petroleum engineering, petroleum geology for exploration and the like, oil, gas law, and the like. Again, it's very geared, very focused, very, very tailored to certain areas, the degrees and specializations, and those are the areas where the Texas economy is becoming more and more uh, uh, based, if you will, okay, and established. So again, there will be two major universities that will be established during this time. One will be the Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College. This is called the Texas A&M, of course, founded in 1871. And the idea of this school was to prepare farmers for this new future of industrial capitalism. Preparing the future farmers of Texas for what's called scientific agriculture, and to work in agricultural companies and corporations, otherwise known as agribusiness, running them, or as simply as their own independent farmers that will have all the skills, all the scientific knowledge of how to actually engage in commercial farming. That was the idea, again, of Texas A&M initially. But also the University of Texas, UT, that was originally founded in 1836, but it did not really begin to function until 1889. It was actually founded in 1836, but due to a lot of changes that were taking place in Texas, like the adoption of Texas into the Union, and then the Civil War, Reconstruction, the university did not really begin really functioning as such until 1889. It was based in Austin. It had also a campus in Galveston, a medical school in Galveston. But again, this university was also serving the needs of the state to prepare the future generations, again, for functioning under this new economy. Academic degrees of various kinds are going to be offered, but also law degrees in law as well. All right, so in sum, what we just covered in session 1, 2, and 3 is that Texas initiates modernization. Again, the traditional setting of Texas, of people growing their own food, living in the countryside, engaging in subsistence farming, or just grazing cattle, etc. Again, that era is really changing dramatically, and we see something new. This is what modernization means. A new society. Again, changes are taking place in the state very rapidly. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with the coming of the railroads. This modern transportation system really facilitated producers in the state to ship out their product outside of the region, even outside of the state. So your product will be consumed elsewhere, all over the country, in other words. So again, this really incentivized people to transform their methods of production. We're going to see the rise then of a commercial industrial economy in the state of Texas. People are moving to capitalism, in other words, to the market very rapidly. Well, there's transportation system. I can make money now. I can ship my product to cities or to other states and make money. Okay, because that is possible now. So we see, industrial capitalism coming into Texas. A host of different enterprises will be created, and also the system of wage labor will be also introduced in the state of Texas. Again, how people are going to earn their living in the state of Texas is through the payment of wages. This is something new. It's called wage labor. People working for a factory, working for a mine, or an industry, a company, a corporation, and earning wages. This is how people are going to now earn their living again. We mentioned a host of different industries, manufacturing shops, cattle ranches, energy companies that are the new capitalist enterprise in Texas, offering again jobs to the peoples of Texas to sustain themselves. And as a result of that, people are going to be moving away from the countryside very rapidly and moving to the large urban centers where the jobs were located, industries. Okay, there's going to be a massive movements of people, from the countryside to those cities, and also people coming from other states as well, even from Mexico. Remember, Mexicans are also coming into Texas as well. So there's demographic growth. There's going to be, of course, social classes. There's going to be people, the working class, just working in, the factories or in the mines. But there's also going to be a middle class, the professionals, the skilled labor, the engineers, the supervisors, the administrators, of course. There's social classes, of course. Women will be moving into the cities, of course, and they're going to enter the workforce. This is called the feminization of labor. We talked about that, just a moment ago. In the cities, people will find new services there that will make their life easier and better. Public utilities and services like natural gas, electricity, streets, paved roads, and amusement centers and entertainment centers, but also education centers as well. Public education and universities will also be found there. So this is a whole new society arising in Texas that did not exist in Texas. Again, so this is a totally new phenomenon. This is a transformation in the way people live, the way people work, the way people earn their living. All of this is new altogether. Okay? This is the end of this topic. We have covered 3 sessions. So next topic, and the 8th topic, we're going to be talking about some of the issues that people were dealing with this transformation, something that will be announced, of course, in the 8th topic in session 1. But as for now, this is just, again, the end of the 7th topic. This is the end of session 3. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you in the 8th topic.